Dear Mrs. and Mr. Rectors, Vice Rectors, Mr. Speaker, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, what a pleasure to speak here on the 200th birthday of this university. And of course I was reminded that the time it was born were the happy days when our two countries were still kind of a united kingdom, I would say. Also congratulations on the many wonderful things that are happening here, and I would say if you keep attracting forces of nature like Liebe, the university will have a glorious future. I'm honored to speak here in Humanities as kind of a simple physicist, so happy to provide some light entertainment here and project essentially an outsider's view on the humanities. Now, by nature, I in some sense have to address this kind of famous gap between the two cultures, the natural sciences and the humanities and social sciences, and the bridges that are being built. And one advantage is, if you talk about bridges, that being firmly rooted in natural sciences, building a bridge, you always have to look at the other side. Perhaps you know the story of this island that was found where time appeared to flow backwards. So anthropologists study this society in great detail, and they discover that in the local culture, physicists are held in very low degree, and historians in very high degree. The humanists get all the rich research budgets, the fancy laboratories, the gigantic, expensive machines, because in this society where time flows backwards, they can predict the future. Is that the fate of the humanities? That in the real world they can only predict the past? Or are actually all the sciences doomed because this world doesn't care about past nor future, but is only interested in the present? I will argue that an important role for the humanities, an important need for the humanities, and also the social sciences and the arts will be from the perspective of the natural sciences. So I have taken liberty to use the word usefulness in my title, but what exactly do we mean usefulness? Now, the past year I've been on book tour with Abraham Flexner, a classicist, educator, and the first director of the Institute. Flexner published a remarkable, prescient, and relevant essay, The Usefulness of Useless Knowledge, in 1939. And by the way, when this book came out, I had a great idea for the publisher. I felt, well, since Flexner's main claim to fame was attracting Albert Einstein to Princeton, perhaps we can get a quote of Einstein. Would it be wonderful to be published, and with Einstein saying, I highly recommend this book. So I looked in the, on my desk, I have the ultimate quotable Einstein, and I look up Flexner, and there's one quote. And this is something that anybody who's involved with administration will appreciate. So Einstein's quote about Flexner was, "One of my few enemies." So I proposed to put this on the book, but that actually the publisher didn't want to do this. Flexner created the Institute as, in his word, a paradise of scholars. Now, it's kind of interesting that even in his time, for instance, one of the famous trustees of the Institute, Felix Frankfurter, a Supreme Court justice, was not really very happy with that description. He wrote to Flexner, well, can you please stop using that phrase, paradise for scholars? Paradise apparently was an excellent place for one person, but it was fatal even for two, or at least for two when the snake entered. And the snake seemed to be an early and congenial companion of man. Flexner is, in his essay, very strongly defending knowledge. First of all, because of knowledge in of itself. As he writes, the consideration upon which I have touched emphasize, if emphasis was needed, the overwhelming importance of spiritual intellectual freedom. It's the mere fact that all these fields bring satisfaction to the individual soul, bent upon its own purification and elevation, is all the justification that they need. And in justifying these without any reference whatsoever, implied or actual, to usefulness, we justify our colleges, universities, and institutes of research. An institution which sets free successive generations of human souls is amply justified whether or not his graduate or that makes a so-called useful contribution. A poem, a symphony, a painting, a mathematical truth, a new scientific fact, they all bear in themselves all the justifications that universities, colleges, and institutions of research need or require. In fact, I know some of my colleagues who even suffer under the so-called applicability of their fields. I have a famous colleague who's a number theorist. You know, number theory is always used as a perfect example of a totally useless profession. Just study the beauty of the numbers. But now it's being used in coding. Because it's actually, the problems are too difficult to solve. So he says he wants to solve these mathematical issues to liberate his beloved field from its applications. But what we're talking about is essentially kind of what I say a second order fact. The realization that the most important transformations in society have not happened because of goal-directed efforts, but became because individuals or groups followed the internal compass and passion to explore the unknown. The paradoxical thing is to be as useful as possible, it's often better to be first totally useless and then blindside the world, catching it from an unaware, hitting it from an unexpected direction. It was Flexner's lifelong conviction that human curiosity, with the help of serendipity, was the only force strong enough to break through these kind of mental walls that block truly transformative ideas and technologies. And he believed that only with the benefit of hindsight can we see these long arcs of knowledge. A famous example at my institute is the development of the modern computer, which came out of the work of logicians who were interested in theoretical underpinning of logic and philosophy, and people like von Neumann and Turing, and not with any kind of practical aim in mind. I mean, one of the great things of being in a university or in research is that we have the pleasure of knowing what we don't know. I like to say that cosmologists are the most luckiest among us because they know exactly what they don't know. As you know, 95% of the universe is kind of missing. Give beautiful words to it, dark matter, dark energy, but it's just an expression of our ignorance. Often I ask my colleagues, also in humanities, now what's your percentage of dark matter? For instance, if you study the Greek tragedies, Aeschylus and Sophocles and Euripides, roughly 5% of their known work has been transmitted. So they also have 95% dark matter in that study. It's very important that in order to explore that unknown, we have to be free to make small steps aside. Here's a quote, which I love very much, by the Russian mathematician Alexander Belenson. And he writes, "We are used to seeing science accomplishments as being fundamental. But over time the magical picture switches and we realize in fact that we know almost nothing about the world. And science is merely an attempt to hide this vast openness. But we are able to wonder and take in new things and to feel gratitude only to the winds that blow through us. The wind that blows through our hole in our ignorance. The fool's way to see things differs from that of a clever person, like peripheral vision differs from central vision. At every moment there are infinitely many possible directions to look at and choose. A fool retains awareness of that. A clever person moves successfully in one or two directions, while forgetting completely the remaining infinity of dimensions. A new understanding, a new mathematical theorem, or a fresh poem starts with a tiny movement in an unexpected direction." Ladies and gentlemen, what is the state of the humanities or sciences itself? There's a famous anecdote that Leonid Brezhnev was asked to say what was the state of the Soviet Union captured in one word. And his answer was good. And then what was his answer if he could use two words? And the answer was not good. And I think actually captures my view on the academic life. It's good because in some sense we live in the best of times. I think never in history have we had so many fascinating questions, so many data, a large pool of talent. Whole continents have came online recently. There are new methods, new techniques, new data. It's actually an excellent time to reinvigorate all the sciences. And in fact, it's perhaps good from the perspective of humanities, to look across the gap and see what is the great arc of the sciences, the natural sciences. And I would say it's roughly moving from building blocks to building. I would say the 20th century can be characterized as the science on search of the building blocks of reality. The molecules, the atoms that make up matter, the cells, the proteins and genes that make up life, the bits and bytes and algorithms that make up information and intelligence. But now we find ourselves in another place. It's now about what can we construct out of these building blocks. The remarkable thing is that in some sense the universe, over 14 billion years and 4 billion years of life on Earth, in a very slow fashion, has explored only the tiniest fraction of everything that can possibly be built. Evolution is an incredibly slow player. As Richard Dawkins liked to argue, we, all of us here, are enormous privilege. We're the winners of a kind of a cosmic lottery that basically has only losers. Because our particular DNA was picked out an infinity of possibilities. Most of them never realized. But this is kind of changing. I think in the next century, we start to explore, with very powerful techniques, this kind of infinity of possibilities. A kind of a new, brave new world with artificial organisms, materials, brains, or even better versions of ourselves. I think it appeals to us and it alarms us. Not least because the pace of change continues to increase, perhaps too quickly. I feel the ship of progress is kind of leaving the inland waterways, is now heading for the open seas, filling with crashing waves. And the real fundamental questions in the sciences are, how are we shaping our future? What kind of technological and moral compass is offered in this endless sea of possibilities? How do we deal with that? Where do we find the individuals that look further and further? One of my favorite Einstein quotes is that there were two things that fascinate him. The physical universe outside and the moral universe inside. And I think these two have to come together. Humanities have a long tradition, and the arts, to struggle with these infinities. We all know Borges' famous Library of Babel, all books that can be possibly written of 410 pages, in any language impossible. Well, the number of these books is already unimaginably large. And of course, anybody who starts writing, in some sense, starts to exploring this infinite sea. But in some sense, the arts are able to kind of master that infinity. Different qualities come in view. It's about creativity, it's about intuition, it's perhaps a historical feel. I often like to share my own personal anecdote that I only learned to do research when I spent 2 years out of my physics education in art school. In art school, I learned to make sketches. I was forced to explore. The only condition was at the end of the week, how high is my stack of material I produced? Not whether it was right or wrong. The kind of studying for the test, which I think is such an infliction in many kind of university fields, was actually absent. And for me, actually, in some sense, that experience was a shortcut to the field of research. Now, there are this infinity of possibilities, and I'm personally strongly convinced that in 100 years, when you will celebrate 300 years of the university, you will look back and say, well, these people who lived in 2017, they were fortunate to be at this period of great dramatic change in society. It must be so exciting to be an academic in that period. But it's also the worst of times, because I think in some sense there's an increasing gap between the intellectual challenges and the environment in which we have to address them. And I think we all agree that a good research portfolio at a university or an institute would be a combination of both predictable short-term research projects as also long-term bets that can pay off, that are very risky, but can pay off with off-the-scale rewards. And a healthy and balanced ecosystem would support a full spectrum. But I think actually our current research climate, governed by imperfect so-called metrics, quantitative ways to capture the values of our research efforts and policies, obstructs this approach. I think the world is ever going to ever shortening time cycles, research criteria becoming dangerously skewed towards very conservative short-term goals that might address these more imaginable immediate problems but miss out on huge advantages that human imagination can bring. I like to joke that journalists now look back on the happy days when the news cycle was 24 hours. These days, 24 minutes already in eternity. And so I think we, just as in Flexner's time, we should value not only the technical expertise, but the underlying core values of research, which in my view are unobstructed curiosity and the benefits and pleasures of traveling far upstream against the current of practical considerations. So what is driving this kind of phenomenon? At first I think is that there are many more top-down agendas. Governments are more and more interested in the outcomes of scholarship and direct research. As a consequence, basic research across the disciplines, I think, is given short shrift. Its budgets are often ending up as a remainder of a growing series of subtractions. And we see this in a lot of top-down initiatives at the national level, here in Europe, at the European level, and worldwide. Grand challenges, lots of kind of social agendas, national agendas, key technologies, and lots of other top-down mechanisms. There's nothing wrong with some kind of guidance from society, but I think the main problem is that all these agendas lead to the same results. In some sense, we get more of the same. We have a risk of having a regression to the average, a kind of a pile-up in the safe center of research. All these quantitative metrics and evaluations, employed with the best intentions, I must say, leads, in my view, to risk-adverse behavior. Bruce Albus, the former president of the National Academy of Science in the United States, wrote in Nature that the current hyper-competitive atmosphere smothers creativity and encourages scientists to conduct average, safe, and uninteresting work. In his words, we must reward people who do something differently. The other thing I already mentioned, the quantification of knowledge, the metrics and the growing culture of public accountability. It puts pressure on our margins of error. We try to eliminate downside, but also we eliminate upside risk. I think, in particular, I think this kind of quantified way to assess the quality and impact of research proposals systematically undercuts path-breaking scholarship in favor of more predictable, goal-directed research. And this number fetishism comes at great cost, particularly, I think, for the humanities and the social sciences, whose subtle, complex values and insights easily become invisible when viewed in this harsh, quantitative light. Now, it's good to know that most of this pain is self-inflicted. These metrics were often devised by academics, they're not by bureaucrats. And in fact, I must say, many come from the natural sciences. So we had needed some incredible, more effective pushback there. But many suffer about this. It's not only the humanities. Many areas in the natural sciences, whether you're a number theorist or a cosmologist, you also don't fit in any of the grand societal agendas. So I would like to argue that the most natural raw material that's currently being exhausted across the world is not water or energy or gas, but it's actually free space and time. I would like to challenge economists to calculate the value of 1 hour of free thinking. There will be incredibly scarce resources. And what also is scary is biodiversity. I think it's not only biodiversity in the biological sense, but also in the biodiversity of our thoughts and minds. I think universities need to be hatcheries, kind of hothouses, where fragile ideas and non-conformist thinkers can flourish. So the problem, of course, is to how do we meaningfully convey this usefulness of useless knowledge? Because often we cannot only see this looking backwards. The path is not straightforward, it has many turns and hairpin turns and dead ends. And Flexner himself admitted that basic research would also inevitably waste some money. I think we have to explain that some of our projects have to fail in order to be much more successful than promised. The time scales can be long, much longer than the typically 4-year periods in which governments and corporations think, let alone the news cycles. It can take many years, even sometimes decades, for a case to turn in fruition. And even if there is a demonstrable correlation with applications, it might be difficult to point to an ambiguous causal chain. Now, sometimes things happen spontaneously next to each other. It's not quite clear who influenced whom. In some sense, I feel knowledge, I always see it as a river delta flowing out. It's spreading across the world, in fact, it's spreading across society. It's very difficult to find the sources. In some sense, I think that's actually a terrific argument. The fact that, fundamental knowledge cannot be captured by a university or a corporation or a country even, means that it's truly a public good. So for me, I'm very optimistic about the growth of academia and knowledge, but I'm kind of negative of the architecture of academia. And I think here is something where the humanities suffer particularly. In some sense, if we would like to have a vision of what the university would look like, I think really in terms of like a beautiful city like Ghent, with its churches, its marketplaces, its castles, while I think many of the modern academic landscape looks more like cookie-cutter houses. As was mentioned before, I was very much taken by an essay I read recently by Erwin Panofsky, the art historian, who actually was a professor at our institute for many, many years. And the essay is called In the Defense of the Ivory Tower. And he says that, we need ivory towers in our landscape. The good thing of a tower is that you can look out and see further. You get a better vantage point and allows you to see a future coming or a looming danger. And in his words, the watchman can only sound the alarm, but in order to do at least that much, it's good for him to stick to the tower. As I said, it's the growth of science and quantification gives particular challenges to the humanities. It's, as the way I see actually, the great movement within the sciences themselves is that moving to areas of greater complexity, areas where the human experience will be more and more important. For me, I think of research as basically a large jigsaw puzzle, where you typically start at the very end, the simple problems, where I think the basic sciences are well positioned. But now we are moving to in the interior, as I said, questions of greater complexity with great social and human implications. I think it's absolutely crucial that humanities play a part in that. Now, these days, you learn a lot about machine learning. There's a wonderful series in the Wall Street Journal called Jobs of the Future. And one of these jobs is a robot psychologist. The point is that in the future, robots will be very clever, but they won't be able to explain to us why they are clever. And so if you're worried whether your self-driving car will still be safe tomorrow, it's a little bit like finding out whether a human being is stable. And so you put them on the divan and you start to do psychoanalysis with them. Another, I think, threat in these things is that, the things happening in incredibly rapid change. And I think the humanities, with their natural tendency to problematize issues, finding different reflections and perspectives, are absolutely necessary as a break in some of these developments. For me, part of the solution to this is that we have to reorient our fields. That in some sense, I think, are giving understanding of all the very diverse ways of doing knowledge. And I think that's one thing which we have perhaps not done enough, is emphasize the common origin of all the search to knowledge, which in my view are curiosity and imagination. Flexner writes, curiosity which may or may not eventuate in something useful is probably the outstanding characteristic of modern thinking. One of my favorite anecdotes is about the Duke of Wellington, the Iron Duke. And by the way, he was called the Iron Duke not because he was such a forceful leader, because when he finally was prime minister, he was so unpopular that he had iron gates to reinforce his house. He famously said that in the business of war and in the business of life, it's to endeavor to find out what you don't know by what you do. That's what I call guessing what's at the other side of the hill. And what he would typically do in his retirement, he would take people in a stagecoach, went to some new area in England, and they would play the game. What lies behind the hill? Is there a forest? Is there a town? Is there a lake? And Wellington was particularly good at this game of guessing. And I think actually it's imagination, our imagination that's able to visualize what's behind the hill. And I think curiosity is the innate human quality to run up the hill and actually look. I think it's now part of millions of years of evolution have shaped our brains in a very natural way to have these qualities. An early advocate, and I mentioned this in my own book, of the role of imagination in science was actually the Dutch chemist, Jacobus van 't Hoff. He was the first Nobel Prize winner in chemistry. And his insight was that molecules were three-dimensional. And he had a wonderful result, but he was severely criticized for his approach. Namely, his current colleagues said that, well, he's basically jumping on this flying horse and he's just declaring this to be true. He literally had a jump of the imagination instead of painstakingly deriving this. And Van 't Hoff was so hurt by that criticism that when he finally became a professor, his inaugural lecture was about this topic, imagination, the power of imagination. And as a good scientist, he approached the problem in a scientific way. So he took a list of the 200 most famous scientists of the last few centuries and put them in three categories. First, those with no imagination, so those who are not interested in the arts, in poetry, in painting. The second category was those with imagination, so they loved to read novels, go to concerts, etc. But there was a third category, what in his language was scientists that showed symptoms of pathological imagination. They had a tendency for superstition, hallucination, spiritism, alchemy, metaphysical speculation. And in fact, it's an interesting list. It's Newton, Leibniz, Descartes, all the most famous ones are in the third category. And Newton famously was interested not only in science, that was only in his early career, but then he became interested in alchemy, in theology, in history. And you can ask why. And I think I know why. No, there's a famous saying by the astronomer Lagrange. He said, Newton must be the happiest man who's ever lived in the history of the world. Because there's only one system in the world, and he was the one who discovered it. In fact, once you discover that the laws of physics apply both to planets and to everyday objects, why not extend this approach and also try to understand history, language, everything? So there was this incredible optimistic view of him. He wanted to understand everything in the world. Of course, it was a little bit too early. But it's very important, that's actually the driving force. And in many ways, in my experience, the great scholars and scientists are often very humble because they feel that they have failed in their efforts, because there's so much more to discover. I think in the 20th century and beyond, imagination is being a driving force of scientists and scholars. And another famous Einstein quote is that imagination is much more important than knowledge. Knowledge is limited to what we know and understand, and imagination embraces the entire world, everything that's there to be known. So I think actually that it's something that we should kind of emphasize much more in the way we present ourselves, how we present our educational system. And I think particularly humanities, if we would put this much more front and center, would play a much more central role in our educational system. I think one thing that I really appreciate in the United States, that there's still a very important role of the liberal arts curriculum. And in some sense that is very important to the health and vitalities of the humanities. It's not seen as a specialized subject, it's something that's philosophy, history is something that, you know, all the students should be part of. And I think actually faced with the threats to our values and in some sense the culture of the Enlightenment that we see across the world, it's incredibly important that we hold hands and close ranks. And I think in many ways, as I said, many fundamental branches of my world, the natural sciences, are as useless as the humanities. Now, it's also important to realize that, you know, if you go back to the origins of knowledge, that the various disciplines were very closely connected. One of the most moving objects, the two of the most moving objects I know, are this wonderful prehistoric flute that was found, I think 37,000 years old. It's wonderful portrayed in the Cave of Forgotten Dreams, this wonderful movie by Werner Herzog. And you see the archaeologists take this little flute and place the American anthem on it. It's really striking. The second thing is this little bone, I think that's here in the Belgian Museum of Science, the Ishano bone. It's from Congo, it's roughly the same year old, and it has little scratches on it, which actually are the prime numbers, 11, 13, 17, and 19. So it's quite remarkable to know that, you know, many, many tens of thousands of years ago, our predecessors were equally interested in the arts and in the sciences. And I think, you know, in some sense we have done a bad job in keeping that unity. If you see in some sense how the building of academia has grown, we see great divergence of fields. And the internal distance between our disciplines seems only to increase. And I think this is of crucial importance to an issue where all the disciplines are united. And I think that really is confronted us in the academic world. And this is what I would like to call the knowledge paradox. And this is the simple fact that research, every day we learn more, it kind of moves away from the everyday world. It's like digging deeper and deeper and deeper underground. So we build this vast system, if I'm allowed to mix metaphors, of underground minds that tunnel into the great unknown. But so it's more and more difficult to explain to the public at large what we are doing. Our language becomes more impenetrable, the arguments more closely, and we will soon reach a moment where it's perhaps only machines that are able to understand what we're doing. But, and this is the paradoxical thing, because of all this increase in knowledge, because of all these details and complexities and technical, logical breakthroughs, we become more relevant. We are more and more have an impact on the world. Our present day lives are much more impacted by science and scholarship and technology than in former years. So in the end, we could end up with this kind of very frightening situation where we're totally governed by the products of knowledge, but they were totally invisible. They're literally in our bloodstream, they are, you know, in our brains or whatever, and we have no control. It's like the title of the famous Wim Wenders movie, Far Away So Close, and Weiter Entferne So Nah. You know, in that movie of angels who are, you know, understand everything, and they can be very close to human beings, but we don't see them. So that might be a frightening role of the knowledge and the academic world. So I think that's very important that we close that gap. And how do we do this? So how do we, in some sense, are able to connect to this? And I think that's perhaps one thing where I feel that we should be very much aware of, which is that I would say perhaps the greatest useful application of the humanities and then all the other sciences, which is the educational field. I think there are, in some sense, many things wrong in our educational system. I think it's in many ways the least innovative element in our society. It's, I feel, still firmly rooted in 19th century thinking, paying attention to what education is, and I totally agree with Helen's remarks about this, that teaching and preparing teachers is an incredibly important application of all our knowledge. And so you can ask, you know, how much do we educate students in schools and universities with our core values, which for me are very much about creativity and passion. And how do we build our structures? I think the modern university has still many interior walls. We celebrate our differences. And I think we do this largely at the cost of our students. And again, this severely undercuts humanities. We see their expertise, but not a crucial role in creating critical thinking. Philosophy, literature, history, theology, I think they really prove their values in addressing universal problems. This is what the famous philosopher Albert North Whitehead said. Each profession makes progress, but its progress is in its own groove. There is no groove adequate for the comprehension of human life. Of course, no one is merely a mathematician or merely a lawyer. People have lives outside of their profession or their business. But the point is the restraints of sheer thought within a groove. The remainder of life is treated superficially with the imperfect categories of thought. Here the challenge of education is to find a way to deepen that knowledge that's inevitably and unavoidably outside of the domain of the disciplinary groove. I think we need this in particular, in the present days. I think, in some sense, we live also in the worst of times, because I feel, and this is particularly strongly felt in the United States at this point, some of the core values of the Enlightenment are under attack. I think knowledge is under pressure in many, many areas of the world. And in my experience, we have a new government that has no qualms about reversing legislation on important issues, try to at least abolish humanities and the arts, proposing draconian cuts to research budgets, and closing the borders to knowledge immigrants. I think we see these attacks on rationality and the fruits of scholarship, not just in the United States, but across the world, even here in Europe. There's a surge of fake news and alternative facts. Now, my favorite metaphor here, but when Donald Trump was elected, I read somewhere that a part of the electorate felt that America was gravely ill and ready for an experimental medicine. Unfortunately, the cure takes 4 years. And I think people should have read the small print. But what I think also is that we now see a serious attack on our immune system of society. But we see also this immune system at work. We see many institutions that have been inspired to have a much more defensive and proactive role. It's the serious press, political parties, but also universities. Sometimes this is called as the Trump bump, that people are in some sense being more aware of the importance of these kind of institutions. And pushing that metaphor. Now, why do we have an immune system creates antibodies? And why do we need antibodies? Because for the next infection, we are better prepared. So I think actually what's happening across the world should have an impact on what universities do and what they teach and how they prepare the students for the future. It's not a time for universities to sit back and keep quiet. It's not business as usual. So they should play a crucial role in this defense reaction because they represent, in many ways, the next generations. And I think one of the university duties is to immunize society against attacks by dogmatic and demagogic thinking and the short-term interests of politics and commerce. In some sense, a laboratory where new generations are educated. So I think this means that this is a great call for public engagement of fields, and in particular, I think, universities, but also the humanities. Because I think it's very important that we share our core values with citizens, and so that they are better positioned to make right choices when confronted with these very complicated problems. And I think here is something, I go back to the ivory tower. Panofsky points out in his beautiful essay that, Goethe in Faust has Lynceus, the famous Greek mythical figure with lynx eye views, as a warden on a watchtower. So he's on top of the tower. And in the beginning of the play, he's very happy. He describes his pleasure. I'm quoting, "For seeing I'm born, for watching employed, to the tower I'm sworn, while the world I enjoy. I gaze at the far, I stare at the near, the moon and the star, the forest and deer." So that's a great pleasure of life in the ivory tower. But then there's a dramatic turn of events. He sees with horror that the fire devours the cottage of Philemon and Baucis, and the chapel and the linden trees, but he can only warn because he's confined to the tower. Panofsky points out this dilemma, that you're either in the tower or on the ground. On the ground, you have the power to act, but not the power to see. In the tower, one can see, but one cannot act. And I think but has a responsibility to warn and call to action. So as something I think that, with that model in mind, I think there are two roles that we have to do at the same time. Again, thinking in terms of beautiful Ghent, I think we both need the towers, but we also need the marketplace. And we need some of us to spend time in the market selling our goods, so to say, or speaking to the citizens, while others take their role in the tower and try to look as far as possible. Because if we don't do that, if we don't play both roles at the same time, we would end up with the unfortunate situation that Goethe describes, and I just want to end by quoting the last two lines of Linnaeus, where he said, "What used to please my eyes below has vanished with the centuries." I think that's the last thing that we want to do. So I think actually, summarizing, I do feel that in the present political situation, what's happening in the world, that the enormous challenges there are for all of us. I think it's a wonderful situation to be alive, to look forward. So I want to congratulate this wonderful university and look forward to the next 200 years, where I think actually we might see a very vibrant role of the humanities, and I'm sure with the good guidance of this university we do an excellent job. Thank you very much.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. I thought that was a very nice evening. It was a very nice closure of the day. We've had a nice day of celebrations today, celebrating our university, but also celebrating our Faculty of Arts and Humanities, who is one of the founding faculties of this university. And we wanted to do that we wanted to celebrate that separately as well. I'd like to thank both speakers. We've had an evidence-based paper from within humanities, a viewpoint from within humanities, and then a thought-provoking paper from an outsider perspective on the usefulness of the humanities, telling us that maybe we should, it's not just issues that are important within humanities, but issues that are very important within science, within academia in general, and that we all share those issues, that we're all driven by curiosity and imagination, which is very true, I think. Robbert said something today that I think Princeton's credo is truth and beauty, yeah? It's probably curiosity and imagination leading to truth and beauty. And I would hope that in the next 200 years of our faculty, of our university, but also of our Faculty of the Humanities, would go for, but then I would say, from a humanities point of view, with a little bit more problematization and a little bit more diversification for truths and beauties in the next 200 years, and that we can pursue that together with all of academia. With that, I think I can invite you all to a reception. I don't think we need to do anything else first. I would actually, before we go to the reception, like to thank Lieve. Specifically, she thanked all of us as the organizing committee, but she was the driving force behind all of it. So I think from the organizing committee's perspective, we really like to thank Lieve again as well. And with that, I think I can invite you to a reception in the peristelium where we can, after we've given some gifts, okay? We have 2 gifts for our 2 eminent speakers. One is in Dutch, which is Gita de Nekker's book, De Ivoren Toren, which is a history of 200 years of